On the morning of August 13th, 2018, the world looked completely normal. The sun was rising slowly, the streets were quiet, neighbors were starting their day just like any other morning. Nothing felt wrong, nothing looked strange. But inside one house, something had already happened, something so disturbing that it would soon shock millions of people around the world. A man named Chris Watts was about to step in front of a camera and pretend that everything was fine. He stood there, calm, too calm, his hands folded, his voice soft. My wife, my kids, I just want them back. At first, people felt sorry for him, a worried husband, a father who had lost everything overnight. You could almost feel the sadness in the situation. But something didn't feel right, not immediately. But slowly, that feeling started to grow. Because when you look closely, his words and his emotions didn't match. His face didn't show panic. His voice didn't break. His eyes looked empty, and within just a few days, that small feeling would turn into something much bigger doubt, then suspicion, and finally a truth so dark that people still struggle to understand it. Because the most terrifying part of this story is not just what happened, it's this: he looked completely normal. This is not just a crime story, this is a story about hidden reality, about how someone can smile, talk, live a normal life while hiding something deeply disturbing inside. And it makes you wonder, how well do we really know the people around us? To understand this, we have to go back. Before the news, before the investigation, before the lies started to fall apart, back to a life that looked perfect. Chris Watts lived in a quiet town in Colorado, a peaceful place, the kind of neighborhood where nothing bad ever seems to happen. Clean houses, friendly neighbors, safe streets. He lived there with his wife Shannon and their two little daughters. And if you saw them from the outside, you'd think they were a happy family. Photos filled with smile, videos of laughter, moments that look warm, real, beautiful. Shannon often shared their life online. Family dinners, birthday celebrations, everyday moments that felt full of love. To anyone watching, it looked like a dream. But sometimes what we see is only a small part of the truth. Because behind the camera, real life continues, and real life is not always perfect. Chris was known as a quiet person, very quiet. He didn't talk much, he didn't express emotions easily, he avoided conflict. To some people, that made him seem calm, gentle, easygoing. But silence is not always peace. Sometimes silence is where emotions are hidden, where frustration builds, where problems are ignored instead of solved. At work, Chris was dependable. At home, he seemed like a normal husband, a normal father. But slowly things began to change, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would alarm people immediately, but quietly. He became more distant, less connected, less present. The kind of change that's easy to ignore at first because life is busy. People get tired, relationships go through phases, but sometimes those small changes are signs of something deeper. There were struggles inside the home, financial pressure, arguments, emotional distance, nothing unusual, nothing extreme, just the kind of problems many families face. But here's the difference: most people try to fix their problems. They talk, they argue, they struggle, but they stay honest. But some people don't face their problems, they hide them. They avoid them, they pretend everything is fine even when it's not. And over time, that pressure starts to grow inside the mind, inside the heart, until one day it becomes too much. Around this time, Chris started changing even more. He began focusing on himself, working out, losing weight, changing his appearance. On the surface, that seems positive, even healthy. But sometimes a change like this is not just physical, it's emotional. It can mean someone is pulling away, becoming someone else, creating distance from their current life. And then there was something else, something hidden, something that would later explain everything. Chris had started a relationship with another woman, a secret, a double life. One world where when someone disappears without a trace, time becomes the most important thing. Every minute matters, every second matters, because the longer the silence, the worse the truth can become. In the case of Chris Watts, that silence didn't last long because someone noticed, not the police, not the media. A friend, Shannon had plans that day. She had appointments, she had responsibilities, and when she didn't respond, it didn't feel normal, it felt wrong. That instinct saved time. Instead of waiting hours or even days, her friend acted immediately. She called, texted, tried everything. No answer. That's when worry turned into fear, and fear turned into action. A call was made, police were contacted, a welfare check, just to make sure everything was okay. But deep down, it didn't feel okay. Within a short time, officers arrived at the Watts home. The house stood quiet, still, no sounds, no movement, just silence. The kind of silence that makes you uncomfortable. Chris wasn't home yet. He was at work. But when he returned, he was met by police officers outside his own house. Imagine that moment. You come home and your life is suddenly surrounded by questions. Chris stepped out of his truck, walked toward the officers. He seemed calm, too calm. He explained that Shannon had taken the kids, that he didn't know where they were, that he was worried. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, but something was missing: emotion, urgency, fear. Because when someone you love disappears, you don't stay discomposed, you panic, you search, you break, but Chris didn't. Inside the house, officers began to look around, and that's when small details started to stand out. Shannon's car was still in the garage. Her phone was inside the house. Personal belongings left exactly where they were. Nothing packed, nothing missing. That didn't make sense because people don't live like that. They don't walk away without their phone, without their car, without telling anyone. And slowly the situation started to feel heavier. This wasn't just a simple disappearance, something was wrong. Chris stayed close, following the officers, answering questions, trying to appear helpful, but sometimes trying too hard creates suspicion. Then came a moment that would later become one of the most important pieces of this case. A neighbor stepped forward. He had a security camera. It pointed directly at Chris's driveway. Footage from early that morning. Police and Chris stood together watching it, and everything started to change. As the video played, Chris shifted his body. He crossed his arms, looked away. His posture tightened. It was subtle, but noticeable. The footage showed Chris walking back and forth between the house and his truck, again and again, loading something, for longer than usual. At first, it didn't look like anything serious, just a man getting ready for work. But timing changes everything, because this was happening just hours after his family was last seen, and suddenly that normal behavior didn't feel normal anymore. The officer noticed it, the neighbor noticed it, and later the entire world would notice it too. Chris tried to explain it, said he was loading tools, getting ready for his job. But his voice felt different now, less confident, more controlled, like he was choosing every word carefully. And here's something important: when someone tells the truth, they don't need to think this much. Their story flows naturally. But when someone is hiding something, they become careful. Too careful. They think before every sentence. They measure every word. And that's exactly what Chris was doing. As the investigation continued, police started building a timeline, step by step, hour by hour. When was Shannon last seen? Who spoke to her last? What happened inside the house? Each question added pressure, and pressure reveals cracks. Chris gave more statements, repeated his story, but small inconsistencies started to appear. Not big lies, just small differences, tiny details that didn't match. And in investigations, those small details matter the most. Because lies don't break all at once, they fall apart slowly, piece by piece. Meanwhile, outside the house, the situation was growing, neighbors were watching, media began to arrive, the story was spreading, a missing family, a worried husband. Chris stepped in front of cameras again. This time the whole world was watching more closely. He spoke softly, asked for his family to come back. I just want them home. But something had changed. People weren't just listening anymore, they were analyzing his tone, his body language, his expressions, and the reaction was different. Instead of sympathy, there was suspicion. Because he didn't look desperate, he didn't look broken, he looked controlled, and control in a moment like this feels unnatural. Behind the scenes, investigators were digging deeper into his life, his routine, his relationships, and then they found something important, a secret. Chris had been involved with another woman, a hidden relationship, a second life, and suddenly everything started to connect because secrets create pressure and pressure leads to decisions. Some people face the truth, others try to escape it. Investigators now had a new question. Was this connected? Was this the reason behind everything? Chris was asked about it. At first, he minimized it, downplayed it, said it wasn't serious. But again, his answers felt controlled, carefully chosen. And the more he spoke, the more suspicion grew. Because sometimes what people try to hide becomes the loudest signal. Then came a critical moment. Chris agreed to take a polygraph test, a lie detector. Now, these tests aren't perfect, but they do one thing very well, they create pressure. Chris sat in the chair, connected to the machine. The room was quiet. The questions were simple, direct. Did you harm your wife? Do you know where she is? Are you telling the truth? Chris answered calmly, no. I didn't do anything, but his body told a different story. The results came back, he failed. Deep sigh, and in that moment everything changed. The calm image began to break. The story began to collapse. The investigators didn't shout, didn't accuse, they simply said, we don't think you're being honest. Silence filled the room, and that silence was heavier than any question, because now Chris knew the truth was catching up to him. He was no longer just a worried husband, he was the center of the investigation, and the pressure was only going to increase. Mm-mm. Because when someone is hiding something, they can only carry it for so long. Eventually, it becomes too heavy, and when that happens, the truth begins to slip out. In the next part, everything starts to fall apart. The interrogation, the psychological pressure, the moment Chris finally begins to break, because now the question is no longer where is his family? Now the question is what did he do? By now, everything had changed. This was no longer a search, no longer a search, no longer a mystery. This was an investigation focused on one man, Chris Watts, the calm husband, the quiet father, the man who stood in front of cameras asking for his family back. But behind that calm face, something was breaking. Chris sat inside the interrogation room, a small, quiet space, no cameras from the outside world, no audience, no escape, just him and the truth he had been trying to hide. Across from him sat trained investigators, calm, focused, patient. They weren't angry, they didn't raise their voices because they didn't need to. They already knew something important. The truth was close. Mm. The questioning began again, slow, careful. Chris, tell us what happened. Simple words, but heavy. Chris repeated his story again and again. The same version, the same answers. But something had changed. His voice was weaker now, his confidence fading, because deep down he knew the lie wasn't holding anymore. Investigators leaned in slightly, not aggressively, but with purpose. Chris, we know something isn't right. Not a question, a statement. That's important because it removes the option to pretend. Chris looked down, paused, took a breath. Silence filled the room, and silence can be terrifying because when everything goes quiet, there's nothing left to hide behind, just your thoughts. And Chris's thoughts were getting louder. Investigators changed their approach. Instead of pushing harder, they softened, they spoke calmly about stress, about relationships, about how people can reach a breaking point. They weren't just asking questions anymore, they were giving him a way out, a way to speak without fully facing the truth at once. Sometimes things happen in the heat of the moment. Sometimes people lose control. They weren't accusing, they were guiding. And slowly it started to work. Chris shifted in his chair. His hands moved. His breathing changed. The pressure was building inside his mind, inside his chest, and then he spoke. But not the full truth. Not yet. He told a different story. He claimed that Shannon had harmed the children, and in anger he reacted. It was a story, a partial confession, a way to reduce the weight, but it wasn't real, and the investigators knew it, because even now things didn't add up, but something important had happened. The wall had cracked. For the first time, Chris had stepped away from complete denial, and once that happens, there's no going back. Had the investigators stayed calm, they didn't argue, didn't interrupt, they let him talk because they understood something critical. When someone starts to confess, you don't stop them. You let the truth come out piece by piece. Chris's posture changed. He leaned forward, then back. His voice quieter now. The calm, controlled image was fading. Now he looked like someone carrying something too heavy to hold anymore. Minutes passed, then more silence, and then it happened. The truth started to come out, not direct, but slowly. Chris admitted he had lied, that his story wasn't deep sigh. And in that moment, everything shifted because now there was no mask left, no performance, just reality. He began to describe what really happened, what took place inside the house, what he did afterward. Each word made the situation darker, more real, more disturbing. The room stayed quiet. Investigators listened carefully. They didn't react emotionally, even though the truth was heavy, because this moment was critical. Chris kept talking, details came out slowly, painfully, and with every sentence, the picture became clearer. This wasn't an accident, this wasn't confusion, this was a decision, a choice, and that's what makes it so hard to understand. Because everyone faces problems, everyone feels pressure, but not everyone chooses destruction. Chris's voice trembled now, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to show the weight he was feeling. The investigators asked careful questions. Where, when, how Chris answered. Now he had no reason to lie. The truth was already out. The control he tried to maintain was gone completely. Now he was just a man sitting in a room facing the consequences of his actions. Hello. Outside, the world was still waiting, hoping for answers, hoping for something different. But inside that room, the reality had already been revealed. This was no longer a search, no longer a mystery. This was a confirmed crime. And the truth was far darker than anyone expected. The investigators now had what they needed, a confession. But they weren't finished, because a confession is only the beginning. They needed details, evidence, locations, and Chris had to provide them because there was nowhere left to hide. The man who once stood calmly in front of cameras was now completely exposed. No mask, no control, just truth and consequences. But even now, one question remained. Why would someone choose this path? Why would someone destroy everything instead of facing the truth? Because understanding what happened is only part of the story. Understanding why is what makes it truly unsettling. In the final part, we'll go deeper, the full reality, the aftermath, and the psychological question that still haunts people today. Because this isn't just about one man, it's about human behavior. and how something so dark can exist behind a normal face. By this point, the truth was no longer hidden. It wasn't a mystery anymore. It wasn't the question of what happened, it was reality. And that reality was heavier than anyone had imagined. Chris Watts had confessed. The man who once stood calmly in front of cameras asking for his family to come home was the same man who knew exactly where they were. And as that truth spread, the reaction was immediate shock, disbelief, anger, because people remembered his face, his voice, his calmness, and now everything felt different. Every word he said before felt empty. Every moment on camera felt like a performance. And that realization is what made this case so disturbing because it showed something uncomfortable sometimes. The danger isn't obvious. Sometimes it looks normal. As investigators continued their work, the full picture became clearer. What happened inside that house was not sudden. It wasn't just one moment. It was the result of something building over time. Pressure, silence, avoidance. Chris had been living in two worlds. One where he was a husband and father, and another where he was someone completely different, a secret life, a hidden identity, and trying to maintain both became impossible because the truth always catches up. Instead of facing his problems, instead of choosing honesty, he made a decision that cannot be undone. And that's what makes this story so difficult to understand. Because everyone faces stress, everyone feels trapped at times, but most people don't choose destruction. Most people don't choose a path that destroys everything. So the question remains, why would someone do this? The answer is not simple, but there are patterns. Chris avoided conflict. He didn't express emotions, didn't communicate openly. Instead of dealing with problems, he kept them inside. And over time, those unspoken feelings grew frustration, resentment, pressure. Huh. And when those emotions stay buried, they don't disappear. They build quietly until one day they come out in the worst possible way. This wasn't just about one moment, it was about a series of choices, small decisions that slowly led to a point of no return. Ignoring problems, hiding the truth, living a double life. And when reality became too heavy to manage, he chose escape. But not the kind of escape most people choose. He chose a permanent one, and that's what makes this case so chilling, because it shows how dangerous avoidance can be, how dangerous silence can be, how dangerous it is when someone refuses to face reality. As the legal process moved forward, there was no long trial, no extended courtroom battle. Chris pleaded guilty, he accepted responsibility, and with that, the case reached its legal conclusion. But emotionally, it didn't end there, because for many people, this story stayed in their minds. It raised uncomfortable questions about trust, about relationships, about human nature. How can someone appear so normal while hiding something so dark? How can someone smile while carrying secrets like that? And maybe the hardest question of all, are there signs that we sometimes ignore because looking back, there were small clues, subtle changes, unusual behavior, emotional distance, but none of them seemed serious at the time, and that's the problem. The most dangerous situations don't always come with loud warnings. Sometimes they come quietly, slowly, hidden behind normal life. This case is not just about crime, it's about awareness, about paying attention, about understanding that silence is not always harmless, and that avoiding problems doesn't make them disappear, it makes them grow. Chris Watts is now serving his sentence, renowned from the life he once had, a life that from the outside looked perfect, but inside was falling apart. Hello. And that contrast is what makes this story unforgettable because it reminds us that appearances can be deceiving, that not everything we see is the truth, and that sometimes the most important things are the ones we don't notice So, what can we learn from this? Not just about crime, but about life. First, communication matters. Talking about problems, facing them, because silence can be dangerous. Second, honesty matters, even when it's difficult, even when it's uncomfortable, because lies always come with consequences. And third, awareness matters, paying attention to changes, to behavior, to emotions, because sometimes those small signs mean something bigger, and ignoring them can lead to outcomes we never expect. This story is not easy to hear, it's not meant to be, because it reflects something real, something uncomfortable, something human. In the end, this is more than just a crime story. It's a reminder that actions have consequences, that choices matter, and that the truth, no matter how deeply it's hidden, will always come out. And maybe the most important lesson is this: don't ignore problems, don't hide from reality, don't let silence grow into something uncontrollable. Because once a line is crossed, there is no going back. Huh. And by then, it's already too late. Uh, and when you sit back and really think about this story, it doesn't feel like just another crime case. It feels unsettling, not just because of what happened, but because of how it happened. But because of how it happened. Because there were no loud warnings, no dramatic signs, just a normal life that slowly, quietly started to fall apart. And that's what makes it so difficult to process. Because we all know people like this, quiet, calm, leisure, people who don't show much emotion, people who keep things to themselves. And most of the time, that's completely normal, but sometimes that silence hides something deeper. This story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Are we really paying attention to the people around us? Are we noticing the small changes, the emotional distance, the things that don't feel quite right but are easy to ignore? Because in real life, danger doesn't always look dangerous. Sometimes it looks ordinary, and that's what makes it so easy to miss. But this story is not just about fear, it's also about awareness, about understanding that problems don't disappear just because we ignore them. They grow quietly, slowly, until one day they become something much bigger, something uncontrollable. And maybe the biggest lesson here is about facing reality. No matter how uncomfortable it is, no matter how difficult it feels, because avoiding problems doesn't protect you, it traps you. And the longer you stay trapped, the harder it becomes to find a way out. This case also reminds us that people are more complex than they appear. What we see on the outside is not always the full story. Behind every smile, there can be stress. Behind every calm face, there can be conflict. And behind silence, there can be pressure building day by day. So maybe the real takeaway from this story is not just to look at others, but to look at ourselves. How do we deal with problems? Do we face them? Do we talk about them or do we hide them, hoping they will disappear on their own? Because they won't. And the truth is, everyone struggles, everyone feels pressure, everyone goes through difficult moments. But what matters is how we respond to those moments. Do we choose honesty or do we choose escape? Because one leads to growth and the other can lead to consequences that cannot be undone. This story stays with people because it feels real, not distant, not impossible, but close. And that's why it matters, because it reminds us to be more aware, more honest, more present with others and with ourselves. So the next time something feels off, don't ignore it. The next time there's a problem, face it. And the next time silence starts to grow, don't let it. Because silence can be more dangerous than we think. Uh, Thank you for watching. If this story made you think or see things differently, make sure to subscribe for more real stories like this. Stories that don't just tell you what happened, but make you understand why. Because sometimes understanding is what truly matters, and sometimes it's what helps us prevent something like this from ever happening again. I'll see you in the next one.